For everyday life today, space is essential. The phone that you carry, has got GPS on it. That GPS relies on the satellites that are in space. We see Elon Musk's Starlink getting out there and communication to internet connectivity that's needed. But when people are just making their normal phone calls, or you're watching television, or as we're doing broadcasting, most of those signals don't go just between wires or fiber optic cables on land. At some stage, they bounce up to a satellite and bounce down again. And never mind all the surveillance that happens from space, not just from a military perspective, but from an economic perspective, watching our weather, watching how crops are growing, watching where fires are around the world so assets can be put to them. So today's lifestyle and today's life, space is critical and is growing more and more important by the day. And therefore, that's why the military domination of space or the military use of space is something that is making people anxious. And space is used in a number of different ways. As I said, there's surveillance that the military could do from space. There's geolocation with the military versions of GPS, or the Russian version GLONASS. The Chinese have got their own versions. Indians are looking at theirs. There is the weaponization of space. Now, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty stops nuclear weapons being permanently stationed in space and was designed to try and demilitarize space. It hasn't been updated since then. And nuclear weapons, you have to remember, most are fired from ballistic missiles. A ballistic missile goes up into space, doesn't quite go into orbit, but it then goes down and re-enters the Earth again. So, but is not permanently orbiting, which is what the 67 Outer Space Treaty looks at. There are other capabilities in space with purely military purposes, other than just the intelligence gathering through optical means. There's intelligence gathering through electronic means, so sniffing in, intercepting the signals either between satellites and ground stations, between ground stations and satellites, to try and get those signals in a way that they can intercept them, they can decrypt them and analyze what's going on. And there are satellites that have been created to try and capture other satellites, take them off their trajectory, stop them from working. And there are satellites with kinetic weapons in them in space, so that they can be used as an anti-satellite satellite, whether that is crashing the satellite or a small element into another one, or whether it's using an explosive device, missile per se, non-nuclear missile, otherwise they'd be breaking the 67 treaty, to blow up another satellite. But that carries massive risks with it, because it would create a debris cloud, and that debris cloud would be very difficult to map out and predict where it's going to go, and it could wipe out your own satellites and everything that you rely on at the same time as trying to intercept the enemy. So domination of space is critical from a military perspective at the moment, but it carries a lot of risks. Authorities in the UK are completely ill-prepared to deal with attacks on satellites or attacks across the critical infrastructure. We are seeing attacks on satellites on a regular basis across Europe. And this is where we see GPS interference. Now, what that's doing is it's not necessarily attacking the satellite itself, but it's attacking the communications link, the ground link that's coming from the satellite down to GPS receivers. So that is an attack on space. And of course, space is an area where grey zone activity can increase, because it's difficult to monitor. Not as difficult as people think, because of where it is. There's a lot of assets monitoring it. It's more difficult to publicly attribute blame for something, because again, countries won't want to say what they can monitor and what they can't monitor, and it's difficult to fix. Russia is sending false messages out to different militaries at the moment. The simplest way is GPS spoofing. It can turn around and tell someone with their GPS that they are 5 kilometers away or 10 kilometers away. As people are monitoring where other things are moving, there can be false signals put in to try and deflect what your intelligence capabilities are picking up, especially if you rely on electronic-related intelligence and mechanisms all of the time. Your spoofing intelligence gathering is something, and spoofing the military is something that, I go back to Operation Fortitude during the Second World War, which is where we convinced Hitler that we were attacking into Europe through the Pas-de-Calais and not through Normandy. And that included things like creating communications that were being intercepted that were completely false but sounded genuine, creating press releases that went out in our national newspapers and were broadcast in the BBC about stories on troop movements and all the rest of it that were completely false because they were hiding what was going on genuinely, by floating bodies with forged plans or false plans out of submarines to be washed up on shore, with Operation Mincemeat that knew would fall into German intelligence hands and eventually get to Hitler's desk, and it did. We created a false army with blow-up tanks and wooden aircraft to try and spoof the German intelligence aircraft that would overfly the UK, and it worked. That was in the 1940s. We're now in the heading towards the 2030s and 2040s. Our ability to do this is an awful lot more sophisticated. Rare earths in the moon, are something that people are talking about, and we're even talking about people going out and mining asteroids and everything else. From a theoretical perspective, it sounds good. From a practical perspective, in getting kit there to carry out the mining, to getting what it is that you've got back to Earth again, it's not economical. We've got more than enough rare earth resources on planet Earth. They're rare because they are in small areas, in relatively small concentrations, where it's not economically viable to get them out of the ground on planet Earth. But it's going to be an awful lot more economically viable to get those out of the ground on planet Earth before you start mining the moon or mining asteroids or going to other planets to mine them. So whilst it sounds great in theory, it sounds great in science fiction, I think we are, I wouldn't even put it decades, I think we're centuries off that sort of activity happening. Well, hybrid warfare is something that we've seen come into the UK. It's got many different facets. The biggest one that's hitting everyone on a daily basis is disinformation. We're hearing of bot farms that are pushing out different stories to try and cause disruption politically, disruption in people's thinking, disruption in government decision making, so that they can't focus on the hostile states. That's combined with cyber attacks and our critical national infrastructure, our power stations, our railway, our airfields. Everything is being attacked from a cyber perspective on a minute-by-minute basis, as people look for vulnerabilities to try and exploit them. And then we're getting into other activities like sabotage, and we've seen sabotage in a number of different warehouses across Europe fairly recently, and we've also seen a rise in assassinations that have been linked back to hostile states. So of course, we had a few years ago Alexander Litvinenko poisoned with polonium-210 on the streets of London. We've had Sergei Skripal poisoned and his daughter poisoned on the streets of the Sleepy Hollow, that is Salisbury in Wiltshire, with Novichok, and Novichok is a very deadly nerve agent. And we've got a lot of concern about the weaponization of different biological agents. So the potential for viruses to be bred to cause an effect in a different community, and people with a specific genetic marker is something that is not beyond the realms of possibility and is a definite probability. And these sorts of grey zone attacks are happening all of the time. What we're seeing with the increased tensions around the world is them growing because they are plausibly deniable. Nation states don't come in with a big flag and a uniform on saying, "This is me attacking you." They will use any means to try and hide what it is that they're doing, including hiring your nationals from your own country to do it, or through criminal gangs or other ways. And it's below a level where it will cause an instant political and therefore the potential for a military reaction. And that's something we have to look at even more closely and decide where our threshold actually is. Because in the UK, certainly, we don't have a national resilience plan, and we don't have that line drawn in the sand so that our politicians can understand what is something we just have to deal with, and then where it gets to an unacceptable level and we have to react in our own way.